Hello again. Here we are back at Herbal First Aid, Herb First Aid at learningherb.com. And what I want to show you now is some basic tools for wildcrafting. This is not a class on wildcrafting. This is a class on first aid, but it's helpful if you have some basic tools so you can gather some medicines while you're doing first aid wherever you are. Well, if it's an outdoor situation, if you're in a city, gathering your medicines often actually means going to stores and buying things like ginger and cayenne. But we'll cover this later. So right now, what I want to do is I want to show you the tableau of wildcrafting things that I commonly bring. I'm one of those people that might have many more things than this, but these are good and basic. So first, I'm going to start off with the tools that I use the most commonly. The tool that I use the most commonly, and I believe everybody should have one, is a knife. And the knife just covers a lot of bases, just for cutting stuff and bandages and keeping it clean. So often the knives get left out, but it's the one thing that's pretty much always on me. After a knife, a good pair of pruners. When talking about tools, it makes sense to buy good quality tools. Expensive does not always mean good here, but generally really inexpensive often means really poor quality tools. So make sure you have at least good quality tools. Otherwise, you're basically going to fill landfills up with broken down tools. So I like Felco pruners. There's a couple of different kinds of pruners. Felcos just fit my hand better. Pruners are going to be one of the most common tools you're going to use to gather plants. It's good to learn how to sharpen the blades. One side's a flat sharpen, the other one is beveled downward. I usually use a diamond file to sharpen these tools to try to keep the spring so that it's not too tight or too loose, keeping it oiled and not too dirty. And when you buy pruners, try to find a pair of pruners that fits into your hand. Hand size matters in them, and so if you have really small hands, and if you use pruners a lot like I do, what's going to happen is your hands just going to get tired because it's going to constantly be pushing on the outside of your hands. So find pruners that are smaller. If you have smaller hands, big size hands, and the rest of them work. There's a number of different kinds of pruners. These are two different kinds of Felcos. Both of them work very well for me. They're just different. Actually, these are exactly the same. Usually you're going to spend about $35 for a good pair of pruners. Keep all of your steel tools dry. Stainless steel doesn't rust, but a lot of these tools are not stainless steel, but steel. Steel is easier to sharpen than stainless steel, but it does rust faster, so you just have to keep them dry. You can see there's rust spots on some of these. Actually, this blade might be stainless steel. So some of these other tools are steel. This is stainless. And then have a good holster to carry your pruners in. You can have something you buy for like $12 or something a friend makes and then very nicely put your name on the back of them. That way you're running away from the authorities and you drop it, they know where to return your pruners to. And just something that flips onto your belt is really handy. That way you can just carry the pruners with you. I have pruners on me very often. The next most important tool, so we have a knife, pruners, and then this is called a Hori. Occasionally they're called farmer's weeders. It's a Japanese name, Hori. And it's basically a piece of metal that's pretty rugged with a handle. They're not very sharp. They sometimes have a saw end on them, but they're not meant for stabbing. That's what your knife, I guess, is for. These are for digging, and they really are fantastic. Once you use a Hori, you'll realize how terrible trowels are in general, because you can just dig pretty far into the ground. So many of the medicines that I use, and probably many of the medicines a lot of you herbalists use, are going to be roots and underground plant structures. So roots, rhizomes, tubers, stolons, the parts underground. And so a Hori is really helpful for getting underground plant structures. And then you can have somebody make you this machismo leather case, or it does come with a plastic case. And so basically what I'm usually wearing on me is a knife, pruners, and a Hori. And with those tools, I pretty much have most of my bases covered. So I'm going to show a few more things here. But I want to say that if you're going to have 3 tools, the knife, a good quality knife that doesn't break easy, a good pair of pruners, and a Hori that you can, and cases for them, you pretty much got most of your situations covered. Of course, if you're traveling by plane, all these things now have to go under the plane into your baggage. So after that, some of the other tools to consider, I would just say make sure you always have a flashlight or a headlight, because in first aid, this will come up later in first aid, but just in general, in your toolbox, make sure you have some kind of headlight that you can wear, because a lot of times you gather the plants during the day, but you process them at night. And so this is a really bulky old Petzl lamp, but it's still my favorite. And so I suggest a good headlamp. You can get a smaller LED these days, you young people with your new fashions. These days I really like my mag light, but that's also because they're great at looking at ponds and looking at toad eggs, which will be a recurring theme here. But they're nice and heavy, and the 4D batteries just means that they last a while. But once again, there's lots of kinds of flashlights. I just use this one because it just holds well and it just lasts a long time. So make sure you have a flashlight in your wildcrafting kit. The next tool that I would suggest is a digging fork. Digging forks are different than composting forks and other kinds of garden forks because of the square tine. So these are called tines. You see that they bend after a while. But this is a pretty heavy-duty fork. There's a couple of catalogs that sell digging forks, but I rarely use a shovel. I use a digging fork to gather pretty much all of the deep things, underground plant structures, roots, rhizomes, stolons, that I'm gathering, and I use a digging fork a lot. So they cost about $50, but they last for many years if you treat them well. Now, once again, these things will rust. So to help avoid rust, if you bring a wire brush, this costs about $1. That way you can see it has dirt on it. Because what will happen is after you gather plants, the dirt will stay on the tines. The dirt will hold water, and the water will cause it all to rust. So just a wire brush is helpful. The other thing that's a little less common, one of my favorite tools, this is a special lead pipe. I spent $75 from Smith & Hawkins for this. I did not. I found this underneath my house, and that this is a really handy tool for bending the tines back in place. So what happens is after a while, you're going to be digging, and you're just going to hit a rock or something as you're digging upward, and the tine is going to bend. So in order to bend the tine back, just throw this handy-dandy lead bar, and then what I do is I put it in the crook of a tree, and then I just bend the tines back, because otherwise it just keep getting worse and worse. So digging fork, wire brush, lead pipe, not really a bar, it's a pipe here. I said all that wrong. Next, pair of loppers. These are Coronas, but any good pair of these or loppers are really useful, and there's two reasons I use them. The first reason is to cut woody plant parts. Many of the medicines I use are trees and shrubs, and so I have to cut the trees and the shrubs, cut the branches off. So if I'm going to cut a tree, I'll cut the limbs off nice and sharp. This works well. So the first part is just cutting the woody plant part. The second part is processing the plant in the wild. So after you gather woody plants, you have to still break them down to make medicine. And what's great about loppers, is that you can take the plant part and just feed it through like this. So if I have a branch in here, I can cut it. So instead of using my pruners, which is really hard on the wrist, I can use the loppers and just kind of keep changing my position and lop away at the medicines that I'm going to make. So good pair of loppers, they cost about $30. They're pretty good. A lot of them have warranties. We'll talk about that later. Next is a saw. I have a couple of kinds. This is just one of many saws. Just to cut off bigger plant parts, to cut off woody plant parts. So a saw. I sometimes carry this small shovel. These are really inexpensive shovels. Those folding shovels that you sometimes see that fold up into these small things, they just break. They're just terrible. You put them in the ground, they just break. They're like trowels in that way. So these are about $12, and they're nice because they fit into a backpack pretty well. And so if I feel like I'm going to have to be digging a bunch to get plants, as opposed to using the digging fork, these are handy. Next, sometimes this is called a draw knife, and this takes bark off of branches and stems, a draw knife. I, of course, always have a tripod and a camera because I love taking photographs, but you don't really have to know that. I carry a heavy-duty shovel. So if I'm going to gather something like ceanothus roots or Oregon grape roots, red root Oregon grape root, the roots just go really far into the ground, the shrubs. And so this is a good one to dig really deep, and it's shanked, I think that's the word, all the way up to here. So this doesn't break very easy. It's never broken, and I've used it in pretty hardcore soils, very dense soils. A pair of gloves is helpful if it's cold outside or if you're gathering prickly plants like nettles. Over here, this is alcohol. Say hello to alcohol. Hello, alcohol. Hello. Many people like alcohol, but we're bringing 5 gallons of 95% ethanol, which would be quite the party and quite the next day's use of first aid since everybody would be puking their guts out all night long. The alcohol is just to make medicines. So it's 95%. Over here are jars. So since I tend to make medicine in larger amounts, these are half-gallon jars. And I like the ball jars because they don't break easily. And then what I do is I tape up the boxes. They don't actually use these boxes anymore. But I tape up the boxes so that the jars stay better separate from each other inside the box. The box doesn't break. I have this burlap tarp down here, and I use the burlap tarp to work on instead of a plastic tarp because I'm often processing plants, and I don't want to just do it on the ground because I'll lose pieces. And then the burlap, which eventually does rip, you can see all kinds of rips in here. But I've had this for maybe 10 years, and I use it all the time. So they're about $25. They're kind of expensive, but it's lasted well. I have a plastic tarp to put over everything at night if I'm still processing it. I have burlap bags, which I use to gather plants along with just normal paper bags. And they're not so easy to find, the burlap bags. Coffee shops are the most likely places. Or if you live in a place that uses a lot of chili peppers or peanuts, that's where you find the burlap bags. So there's a lot more that I can cover about wildcrafting tools, but for right now, I just want to reiterate for this class, what I'm suggesting is a good knife, good pocket knife, pruners in a case, Hori in a case. Now you've got your major stuff covered. After that, a digging fork for all these underground parts that are further below, a saw for woody bits, Loppers, again, for woody plant material and also to process the stuff when you're back at your campground or wherever you are. A wire brush to clean tools that will rust. A lead pipe for bending the tines back on the fork, which happens pretty often. A draw knife, which is a knife where you take the bark off of things. You can also just use a pocket knife. This works better. A small shovel, in case you're digging lots of holes. A larger shovel if you know that you're going to be digging roots that are really far down, especially in hard-packed soils. Burlap bags in order to wear them and give yourself the late 1920s Depression-era look. Plastic if you want to give yourself a more modern Depression-era look. Green plastic works well for that. Of course, this is used to cover up plants at night, the burlap bags for gathering. Gloves, cold, wet, thorny things. Alcohol to make medicines, jars to make medicines, and then there's a whole bunch of other medicine-making stuff. But this is the basic. The next part, if I'll have John bring the camera in, are things that I use to identify plants. So we're jumping from wildcrafting to identifying. So this is the leather bag I used to carry my plant identification kit. There's not too many things in here. It's pretty straightforward. So one, of course, must have an old leather bag. Actually, the leather bag is handy because one of the important parts of a a botany kit, botany meaning plant identification, is a good pair of tweezers. So I use these tweezers to pull plant parts off, to look at them more carefully. But these are the best first aid tweezers. So just to cover this again, these are tweezers that I use for plant identification, but I also use these tweezers for first aid. And the reason that they're so good for first aid is because they're really sharp and you can get in deep. So when you're trying to pull a splinter out of somebody, what you have to do though is anchor your hand, right? Because if these are sharp, if somebody hits me here or if I stab, it's going to leave a hole in somebody. The reason I'm saying that now is because the reason I have a leather bag is because I have really sharp tweezers, and even with the leather bag, the tweezers will sometimes go through. But botany tweezers, also great for first aid. These are magnifying lenses. They're called loupes, L-O-U-P-E-S. And I carry at least 2 different powers, meaning the strength of them. This is a 20 power, and this is a 10 power. Loupes are essential in plant identification. So if you're trying to identify plants, you'll need something to look at, unless you have some incredible eyes that will magnify themselves, in which case I suggest don't do herbal first aid, but become a superhero. There's always a need for superheroes. So loupes are magnifying lenses. Scissors. These scissors are to cut plant parts to look at things more carefully. Yes, one mangles plants when identifying them and while gathering them for medicine. A ruler with metric and imperial, the American system, on both sides, well, the British American system. Because a lot of books that you're using for identification will ask you the size of things. Often, though, they're going to use millimeters. And last in here, so it's not very much. Last in here is another pair of tweezers that are self-closing. So that way, if you take a small piece of something out of a plant, you can then put it in here, and that way you can just put it down. As if let's say I was trying to examine what looks like dental floss. So if you had to examine some dental floss, let's say, you can put it in here and then put them down, and then you can use your loupe to see if there's any microbes on the dental. And this is pretty nasty looking dental floss right here. So I would suggest not using this dental floss for medicine. Maybe though you can sew up a new patch on your corduroy hoodie with this. One more thing I think is in here that is really helpful is just razor blades. And the razor blades are, again, this is all about plant identification. And so the razor blades, you can just cut the plant apart. So basically, razor blades and scissors are to cut plants up, to look at them more carefully, to identify them. So this should become apparent, though. So also, if you're doing first aid, you all of a sudden have 2 or 3 useful tools for first aid. You have loupes, magnifying lenses. If you're looking to see if somebody has a splinter in them, this will really help. Or sometimes a bee sting to see if the stinger is still in them. So you have this for first aid. You have a scissor that could be used for cutting bandage tape. You have a razor blade if you need to cut something open a little bit to remove something from somebody, such as a splinter. And then tweezers to pull splinters out. So actually, your botany kit does work as well as a first aid kit. So these are some of the things that you can use both of these for. And I think that's it as far as wildcrafting and botany, as far as just the tools. Of course, being somebody who's very tool-oriented, I have many more, but these are basic things. Basic botany kit, basic wildcrafting. Once again, though, pruners, Hori, knife covers most of your wildcrafting. Then if you want to make medicine, then you need the supplies for that. And a camera is important too. A backdrop of daffodils, though, also can be very lovely for your wildcrafting expeditions. That way, people will mistake you for Tiny Tim and will try to marry you on public TV, which will raise your fame and prestige.